and welcome to my senior project. Over the past couple of months, I've been baking a wide selection of cakes, such as vanilla birthday cake, blueberry lemon bundt cake, chocolate marble cake, vanilla cupcakes with frosting and fondant, and crumb cake. Before I get into this project, I wanted to give some background information on the history of cakes and today's cake and baking industries. While modern cakes, like the ones we know today, have only been around since the 17th century, the first cakes actually date back to ancient times. The ancient Egyptians were the first people to exhibit baking skills and bake simple cakes, ones which were very bready in appearance and sweetened with honey. Many ancient cakes also contain dried fruits. Birthday cakes actually date back to the 13th century, when German children began celebrating their birthdays with cake and candles, which were symbolic of the light of life. In 17th century Europe, due to advancements in baking technology and a greater access to ingredients, modern day cakes were created. These cakes were round and topped with
Today,
icing,
cakes
just like
have
the ones
developed
we
into a
know and
large
love
industry
today.
which greatly contributes to the American economy. The overall baking industry employs almost 800,000 people in the United States and has a total economic impact of $154 billion. Cakes have always been an influential part of American society. For example, when World War II broke out, nationwide rationing resulted in the production of simpler cakes. Most cakes during this time were made with only 4 ingredients: butter, eggs, sugar, and flour. During the post-World War II boom, the cake industry began to produce bigger and more detailed cakes, and also contributed to the more materialistic economy by mass-producing cake mix for the first time. The same is true for baking podcasts, baking YouTube channels, and baking books and magazines. Pictures of cake can be found all over apps like Instagram and Facebook. The rise of social media has influenced bakers to start their own social media accounts where they can share pictures of their creations and advertise to users. This is a very successful business tactic, considering that nearly 45% of US diners have eaten at a restaurant or bakery because of a social media post from that establishment. In a study conducted by Hershey's Chocolate, it was discovered that the number one food that Gen Z posts to social media is dessert. Cakes are no exception. The rise in dessert pictures has influenced bakers to focus more on the visual appeal of their cakes in hopes of marketing to social media users in search of their next post. The coronavirus pandemic has had both a negative and positive impact on the baking industry. During the start of quarantine, people purchased more comfort foods instead of maintaining healthier diets. Sales in the bakery aisle of supermarkets increased by 62.3% over the week ending in March 15, 2020, and continued to grow from there. However, small business bakeries struggled to make money, and many were forced to go out of business, accounting for some of the 110,000 restaurants which closed during COVID. I made multiple cakes over the course of the last 2 months, and I researched multiple cakes before deciding on the ones that I wanted to make. I tried to make cakes that pushed me to learn different baking skills. So, for example, with my chocolate marble cake, I had to learn how to use a bundt pan, while with my crumb cake, I had to learn how to make crumb toppings and how to arrange them in a visually appealing way. After choosing a cake, I would look up YouTube tutorials to help guide me through the baking process. I baked my first cake by reading a recipe, but I quickly realized that I learned best when watching videos and learning visually, so I switched to video-based tutorials. After finding a video tutorial for my cake, I would copy down the cake's recipe and go through my pantry to figure out which ingredients I needed. Then I would walk over to the supermarket and pick up my ingredients. I would then come back home, lay out my ingredients, and begin following the steps from the recipe. Once I had created my cake batter, I would bake my cake, wash my dishes, and serve the dessert to my family and friends. I definitely had a lot of challenges throughout this process, and the main challenge that I came across is that I originally set out to make 10 cakes, but I quickly realized that each cake took me a lot longer than I thought it would have to make. So I originally thought it would take me 2 to 3 hours to make each cake, but most cakes took me around 2 to 3 days to make. So on the first day, I'd spend a couple of hours making my cake batter, which I would then usually leave to cool overnight. And then mixing my ingredients alone would take me about an hour or two because I wasn't used to the process, and I had to use an electric mixer, which took me a couple of times to get used to. And so then the next day, after my batter had been cooled off, I would make my frosting and my toppings, which I would then place on my cake. And then if I was working with fondant, it would take me another day to work on the cake because I never worked with fondant, and I was making my fondant homemade
So not only did I have to make the fondant, but I also had to design it and place it on my cake. But the lengthy baking process allowed me to have an even deeper appreciation for professional bakers, which is definitely a big takeaway that I took from this project. I was exhausted after baking one cake, so I now understand just how time-consuming of a job running your own bakery can be. Another challenge I faced was working with measuring tools. Sometimes the recipe would give me a measurement that I was missing or I didn't have, so I would have to figure out another way to get that measurement, and usually I did this by converting a measurement I did have into the one that I needed, like using 3 teaspoons to make a tablespoon. The process of converting was challenging at first for me, and I was a little afraid that I was going to mess it up. But after double checking my calculations, I felt pretty confident in my work, and I got used to the process of converting measurements. And then one last challenge I faced was using an electric mixer for the first time. So when I first removed an electric mixer from the bowl, I forgot that you had to shut the appliance off before taking it out, which resulted in my ingredients flying halfway across the room. So while it did take me a couple of tries to get used to the mixer, once I figured out how to use it, it became a pretty easy step in the baking process, and I feel a lot more confident in my mixing abilities now. I also had a lot of achievements during this project. One of the most rewarding parts of the baking process was learning how to decorate a cake. Before this project, when I did bake, I avoided decorating any of the desserts I made because I was afraid I would mess up the dessert. But after learning to bake through this project, I felt much more comfortable decorating my desserts, especially when it came to things like frosting, toppings, and definitely fondant, which I had never worked with before. So specifically for fondant, this was my first time decorating with fondant. I had never made it, and I had never used it to decorate my cakes. So I decided to decorate cupcakes for my first time working with it, instead of large-scale cakes to help me ease into the process. My first decorated cupcake was just a trial run, so I just played with the fondant and shaped it into random designs to help me become more familiar with the fondant. But then once I became more comfortable with it, I moved on to my real designs, and I quickly learned how to become creative with the fondant. So for example, I made one cupcake with an ocean scene, where I combined blue and white fondant to resemble waves. And I also decorated a cupcake where I shaped my fondant to look like trees, and sprinkled powdered sugar on the icing to resemble snow. One important thing I learned about fondant during this project is that it's really sticky when you first make it, but it hardens when exposed to air. So if you leave your fondant to sit overnight, like I did, you can reknead it in the morning to make it workable again. It's also really important to have a plan of how you're going to shape your fondant so that your decorations come out pretty and neat. Overall, this project allowed me to become a lot more confident in my baking skills. Not only did I learn how to work with various ingredients such as fondant and frosting, but I also became familiar with baking techniques and terminology. I hope to use the skills I've learned from this project in real life, especially when I enter adulthood and have to learn how to cook for myself. For those who are baking for the first time, my advice would be to be as precise as possible with your measurements. Baking is like a science. Every measurement is perfectly curated to ensure the best results possible. While it's not the end of the world if you mess up, it can affect the taste of your cake. Another piece of advice I have is to become familiar with baking terminology before you start baking. A lot of recipes use words like sift, simmer, and toss, and if you understand what these terms mean ahead of time, it will make the recipe a lot easier to follow. If possible, you should also practice using your baking appliances before you bake your cake, as some appliances can be difficult to work with. Lastly, if you're working with measuring cups for the first time, make sure to double check that you're using the correct measurements. If the recipe calls for a measuring cup that you don't have, you can always look up a list of measuring equivalents to help you get the amount you need. All in all, have fun, get creative with your decorations, and enjoy the process. There's nothing better than making a delicious dessert for you, your family, and your friends to enjoy. Bon appetit! Lastly, I wanted to talk about my final product for this project. For my final product, I started a blog called the Baked Goods Blog, where I uploaded pictures from each step in the recipe and discussed the highs and lows of the baking process. This blog allowed me to showcase my baked goods while tracking my progress throughout the project. I hope you enjoy it.